Hello, 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 and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. We are joined by a special guest. Look down there, people. We have a third person in attendance. I am so excited to introduce you guys to my guy. This sounds so weird now, all of a sudden. So Paul is my hypnotherapy guy. I've mentioned you on the podcast, believe it or not, Paul, on occasion. And I know I've mentioned you in Bodmap Freedom, but Paul is a licensed marriage family therapist and is a board certified fellow in clinical hypnotherapy. So I started working with you, what would you say, like 5, 6 months ago, doing some
That sounds
sessions
about
with
right.
hypnotherapy. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was like right around the new year that we started working together on and off again. And, you were recommended by a friend, and I just had such a great experience. And we've had so many great conversations talking about mental health and therapy and like what I don't know, I don't want to say what works and what doesn't work, but like what best serves the patient who's
Yeah.
struggling with mental health stuff.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have you on to talk about that and just kind of pick your brain a bit. So can you tell
Definitely.
us a little bit about like some of what you've worked with before, or where do you want to start? Because
Well,
the sky's the
I,
limit. We're just here to talk to you.
I'll give you just a little bit of, maybe a little bit of background of kind of how I got to where I am, because that gives some context.
Mhm.
I've worked with lots of different types of people throughout the years. I was first licensed in 1992. I certified as a clinical, or no, 1994, I guess, certified as a hypnotherapist in 92. So it's 30 years. This year marks 30 years. And early on, I did a lot. I was also an addictions counselor. So I worked in an inpatient treatment center for adolescent felons. So as an alternative to prison, they would come into our system. I did family therapy there. Um, had a period of time where I was specializing in traumatic brain injury, and I worked in a traumatic brain injury clinic, which is a whole nother story related to my own experience. So I won't get into big detail, but I started my private practice, and then a few years later, I was in a severe car accident, broke my neck and my back, and herniated a disc and got a traumatic brain injury. And the traumatic brain injury made it so that I couldn't really function. So it was about a year and a half recovery. And anyway, so when I got back into practice again, that's when I started with a traumatic brain injury clinic, because I had experience kind of from the inside and out,
Yeah.
which gave me a different kind of understanding for the clients I was working with. And then, this was, kind of late 90s, early 2000s when the managed care was coming in, and a lot of shifts in the insurance as all the big conglomerates kind of bought up the smaller insurance companies, and they were looking for ways to save money. So figured that you couldn't see a traumatic brain injury on a CAT scan or an MRI, so probably they could get away with not paying, and that's exactly what they did. I was in a clinic with, I think, 12 different practitioners. We had neuropsych, psychiatrist. I did all the therapy. We had occupational therapy, speech therapy, the whole 9 yards. Then about 3 months, everyone was out of business except for me, the neuropsych, and the psychiatrist. And so I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and backed away from therapy at that point. I had a background because of my recovery from that brain injury. Part of that was giving new stimulus to my brain, and I decided to try and learn computer stuff. Actually, not trying, I did. So I got a degree in computer information systems in that time, so I fell back on that. Went into the business corporate world. Was VP of IT for a multi-billion-dollar corporation for about 12 years. And then realized that wasn't really my calling. My calling has always been helping people, being a therapist. I was good at IT, but I was never awesome. There were people who were a lot more awesome at that than I was. So I took the big leap, and I resigned a ridiculously high salary, stable position with the help of my encouragement of my wife. And I went back and I took my licensing exams over again, and my certification exams. I did it all over again, and then I've been back in practice for about 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Well,
kind of what gets me to where I am.
yeah. Well, and I know one of the things that the initial draw for me to come work with you was the hypnotherapy, because I had shared before I had had some experience with that, with like the ear, nose, throat doctor kind of PTSD stuff. I had worked briefly with another person, and then a friend started working with you and raving about you, to be honest. So I made the switch, but I found we've had a couple of sessions too where we just talk and kind of have like more of a therapy session. And there's just
Yeah.
been some really good stuff that's come of that. And I know one thing that we talked about kind of early on was this idea of like, and I could be um, mislabeling this or misrepresenting this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like what I would kind of label as talk therapy
Mhm.
and like, psychoanalyzing and taking a deep dive and this idea that you have to really understand
Mm.
your mental health and you have to understand your triggers and your traumas and you have to dig into them and like psychoanalyze the crap out of them.
Mhm.
um, that world versus being really like action oriented and like, okay, you are a person who's experienced this trauma or these stressors, but what can you do to help you now? Like, what action steps can you take now? And I really liked that differentiation because I do think like talk therapy can be helpful for some people, but if you get overly caught up with just like ruminating and stewing on the trauma and the history, you can get stuck there, right? Do you want to elaborate on that at all? And did I do that justice,
I could,
hopefully?
yeah, I know you did. I could probably talk about that all day. So, but yeah, I think, historically in the therapy realm, coming out of the kind of roots of psychology, which are based in the medical model, um, we sort of got this idea that, yeah, if you have trauma, you need to go back and just sort of hash through it, and kind of the more emotional, the better. And I can remember
Yeah.
when I was in training as a therapist, sometimes therapists would come out and you'd say like, how was your session? And they'd be like, really awesome. And you'd say, well, what made it awesome or whatever? And they'd say, oh, the person was just really tearful and they were really just connected to their pain and stuff. And I remember listening and going, but do we know that's awesome? Right? Or do we just sort of we come to believe that's awesome for some reason? And I don't believe there's a lot of research to support that notion that just going back and experiencing trauma again is actually helpful. But
Yeah.
certainly there are therapists who still have that orientation. But my orientation has always been solution focused. And there's several things that means. One, it means that it's less pathologizing. So the client, I often refer to clients rather than patients just because,
Mm.
patient can have that pathologizing sound to it.
Yeah.
It's, it's more focused on people get stuck in patterns of thinking,
Mm.
patterns of relationship, and we repeat the same cycles over and over and over again. And they're cycles that don't work. Um, And so
Yeah.
even some of the subtle language around solution focus, I don't talk a lot about something being good or bad or right or wrong. I talk a lot about what works and what doesn't work. If someone's
Mm.
stuck in a cycle, they're repeating it over and over again, and it's not working for them, then you need to get in and help them recognize that cycle, change that cycle so they can move forward. And
And
it
I feel
could
like,
be, oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think we talked about this at one point, or maybe it's a mishmash in my brain of something else, but the idea that a pattern or a behavior might have served you well in the past, but
Yeah,
it's not necessarily serving you well now, right? Like
yeah,
that can
yeah.
be an important distinction sometimes to have people realize too.
Absolutely, and that's where the hypnotherapy tends to come in. So I combine hypnotherapy a lot with cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's
Mm.
kind of ironic because hypnotherapy is all about the unconscious, cognitive behavioral therapy is all about the conscious, and so it seems counterintuitive, but they both serve a purpose, and when you combine them, I think it gets really powerful.
Mm.
But yeah, your unconscious mind at some point in time, if you're experiencing something challenging or trauma or whatever, your unconscious mind will come up with a solution. But but
Yeah.
really, language and logic and math are more conscious mind stuff. They're left brain, whereas unconscious is more right brain. That's more emotion and habits and appreciation for aesthetics like art and music, those kind of
Mm.
things. And so your unconscious mind, since it's not in the same kind of area where the logic is, it'll give you a solution. And it's a great solution. It probably helps you survive. 20 years later, it may not be really helping you much at all. But your
Yeah.
unconscious mind has grabbed onto that because it worked. And so kind
Yeah.
of pulling some of that out and re-examining it and then putting it back in for hypnotherapy.
Yeah. And I will say too, because you just reminded me of something semi-related, I think that maybe one of the big turnoffs that people have to the idea of working on their stress or working on their mental health or like going to see a therapist, if you think about it, the idea of reliving a traumatic or stressful event is really very, very unappealing. Nobody in their right mind wants to go back to the day they almost died, or the day they were assaulted, or the day that their house burned down. Like, nobody would do that willingly. And then well-intentioned practitioners, like in our space, for example, in like functional medicine or dietetics, we might see a person who's really, really anxious and say, hey, you would benefit from therapy. But then the thought of rehashing that trauma and like opening up the wound again and pouring salt in is so unappealing that the person doesn't ever do it. So I like that there's this other approach where it's like you don't necessarily have to spend hours upon hours upon hours upon hours reliving the trauma and psychoanalyzing the crap out of it and analyzing it. You can focus more on the solutions and like the patterns as opposed to the actual trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, when people come in, so the other part of kind of the way I work is that I'm a systemic therapist, which really gets into those patterns and cycles that we repeat over and over again. And from that perspective, one of the least effective or, potentially damaging things that a therapist can do is become part of that client's system in a way that supports or reinforces what's not working for them. Right. And as a therapist, you inevitably jump into the middle of other people's systems. You become part of that system, but you really have to be alert to and intentional about what role you're playing in that. And so when I think about if a client comes into therapy and let's say they're sort of stuck in this point in the past and it occupies a lot of their time and their emotion and they're just really stuck. For me, a therapist who then goes there with them and gets stuck there with them is now a professional who's enforcing that it's an okay thing to be stuck, which is one of the reasons why I have this orientation. I absolutely appreciate that people have trauma. We all have trauma at times, and that impacts how we behave and think today and feel. That's legitimate. But for me, it's you go back there, you figure out kind of the context of that, and you pull it forward because one thing you can't change is the past. Right? Change the present and future. And so solution focus is about what can you do now? What can you do in the future? How do we build a vision, which is where hypnosis comes in again, because the unconscious language is vision. It's not verbal. How do you create a vision for where you're going? And then that connects with the emotions that are also unconscious. And there you get the passion to go.
Yeah, this is so interesting because I would say like my experience with therapy was very similar to what you're describing, where it's like, it felt like a lot of living in the past and not necessarily the solutions-based focus that you're describing. And I know too, like, my husband went to this therapist a little bit longer than I did. And it was interesting because I felt like he just kept giving books. Like, oh, read this whole book. And I'm like, oh my God, like, could he give you like a couple solutions or something versus trying to get such a deep understanding of what's going on? And I think there's value in potentially understanding, why you might behave a certain way to some extent. But then I think, again, I like that you're saying you have to pull it forward and actually establish some habits or some things to do that can help you put some of these things into practice and not just kind of keep ruminating on the same issue over and over again.
Yeah. If you're open to it, I'd like to give even a little bit more context to that, kind of a conscious unconscious perspective, because there's, and you've heard me say this before, Nikki, but there's at any given moment you've got 11 million bits per second of data coming in. If you put it in computer terms. And it all comes into your unconscious mind. If you think about an iceberg, right? Your conscious mind is that little teeny bit at the top, and then underneath the water is your whole unconscious. You're opening and closing the valves of your heart and pores of your skins and blink your. I mean, your unconscious mind has a massive amount of capacity and resource that your conscious doesn't have. Your conscious mind can handle about 400 bits per second. So if you think about that, that's really profound. You've got 11 million every second, 11 million bits of information coming in. You can handle about 400. So what that means is that your brain, one of your brain's biggest jobs is literally to block out the vast majority of reality. And it does that through a filtering system from your unconscious to your conscious mind. And that filtering system that sits between the iceberg and the water is what we attend to. I mean, what we attend to is huge. I mean, advertisers know that. Every moment, there's a million things fighting for our attention, and there's only a couple that we actually attend to. In that filtering system, we all use the same three tools. We delete stuff, we distort stuff, we generalize stuff. It's the only way we can function. If we didn't do that, we would be constantly overwhelmed. We'd be blithering idiots. We couldn't even function. But the way we use those three tools differs based on our past and our temperament and all those kind of things. And so that's why two people can experience the exact same experience and walk away with very different realities of that, right? One might be super traumatized. The other one might be a lot less traumatized, or might see that as an opportunity for growth. And so when you recognize that you can intentionally manage that filtering system, you suddenly get a whole lot of power. So if someone comes into me and their attention and filtering system has been stuck for a long time on that traumatic past, and none of that filtering system is looking at growth or toward the future, they come in a real deficit. And so if I jump in that deficit with them, if there was some really, really clear research that, that showed if you go through this massive pain, it will absolutely help. And we know that. I would be a little more open to that approach. I just don't see that in the research or in my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. I think that people will get stuck there more than likely. And I had another thought to share too, but this one's more important. We had talked about this a little bit recently, because I had said in one of our sessions that one thing that is a stressor for me that I'm learning to manage is like the balance between being empathetic with my patients and my students versus feeling like I'm absorbing all of their stress and trauma and whatnot. Because the people that Amy and I work with are generally very deeply frustrated. They've been sick for a long time. They're oftentimes anxious or depressed. They're really burned out. They're not very trusting anymore because they've been to a million different, specialists. They've tried all the diets. They've tried all the herbs. They're just fried. And interacting with that all day, every day as a profession can be a little bit exhausting at times. And I've been trying to learn how to manage my energy a little bit more around that. But one of the things that came up in our discussion a week or two ago with that was this idea of not only is the provider jumping into that traumatic past and getting stuck there with the patient or the client, maybe that's not serving them super well. But then, and again, maybe I'm butchering this, but you had mentioned the idea that that person is going to be that much more impressionable, and whatever that clinician or that provider says is going to stick that much more. And I'm curious, could you word that better and elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I think that that's going to be super relevant for the people that we work with, and I'll share why that is after you kind of clean up what I just said.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, no, I can definitely do that. So, and some of this comes back to hypnosis and NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, has a lot to do with that and the language focus. But there's something called a PGO spike that happens in the brain, and it happens naturally right before we go into REM sleep. And so even though hypnosis is not related at all to REM sleep directly, or not related to sleep directly, that process is similar. And there are other times during the day when we get a PGO spike. And a PGO spike can be when your routine that's really rote memory is interrupted, or it can also be if you're startled or if you experience trauma or remember trauma. The thing about a PGO spike is in that moment that someone's having a PGO spike in their brain, they become much more suggestible. This is why if you ever go to Las Vegas and you watch stage hypnotists or street hypnotists, sometimes you'll see them do something where they literally kind of startle. They'll come up and they might put their hand on the back of their head and kind of pull it forward and go sleep. And it's such a bizarre thing that As they do that, their brain goes into a PGO spike, and then they quickly start adding in suggestions, right? So what happens in a case like you're talking about, if someone comes into a therapist and they say, hey, and they open up about, let's say, an assault experience, as a kid. At that moment, as they open up that tragedy, their brain PGO spikes, which means that they're in a highly suggestible state. And I didn't mention earlier, but I also do clinical supervision. I'm a graduate instructor at Colorado State University in their program. So I spend time behind the one-way mirror, watching newer therapists. And sometimes I've had experiences where I'll watch the client come in and they'll say something about a tragic past. The therapist, in really wanting to show empathy and that they're hearing and understanding, and sometimes start saying things like, that's really horrible. And I know that we can work on that. And it'll take a long time, and it'll probably be really painful. And I'm on the phone calling saying, come behind the one-way mirror, stop talking.
Shut up.
You've got a client who's in a PGO spike. Now you have a professional reinforcing all of the beliefs that they've already heard about this is unrecoverable, this is going to change the rest of your life. If you're going to get through it, it's going to be really painful, it's going to take forever. It's like, why would you give all of those suggestions to someone, right?
And I think that honestly that happens even outside of the world of therapy. I think that happens in our world a lot because Amy, think about the person who, especially, honestly, I'm going to call out my profession again, functional medicine doctors will very frequently say, you'll come in for the 8 millionth follow-up appointment. You've been doing the diet, you've been doing the supplements, you've been doing the whatever for the SIBO or the IBS, and your test results are still positive. You still have SIBO. And what does the doctor tell you 99.9% of the time? This is a really bad case of SIBO. This is the toughest case I've ever seen. We have to do something more strict, more regimented. You have to cut out more foods. And here's this patient that I already said is very untrusting. They're traumatized by their own medical journey. They're burnt out. They're exhausted. They're depressed. They just want their life back. They're feeling like garbage and they don't know why. They're mustering enough trust to put their trust in this provider and seek out help for the umpteenth time probably. And then when they get the bad news that, you still have SIBO, the test results are still positive, they're probably going into one of these PGO spikes that you're describing. They're highly suggestible. And then the freaking practitioner tells them, this is the worst case of SIBO I've ever seen. This is going to be really tough. You have to do this more restrictive diet, or we have to load you up with $8 million worth of supplements. And I could just tear my hair out because this happens so frequently.
Yeah. Even I have clients come in, there's that whole realm of I work with a lot of clients with physical challenges as well. Thoughts and fibromyalgia, and a lot of those kind of syndromes that people come to me with. It's because Western medicine maybe doesn't really know what to do with them yet. Haven't been able to find an answer. And so a lot of times people come to me and they'll say, well, I talked to the doctor and the doctor says there's no cure. And I go, how, again, I focus a lot on language. How would it be just different if the doctor said, we haven't learned yet how to overcome this, or I don't personally know of a way to move past this. Okay, so it's not, there is no cure because we don't know. Just because we haven't found something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, we know.
Well, I think I shared with you when we had this conversation a while back was like with autoimmune diseases, for example, we don't know of a surefire cure for all autoimmunity yet that I'm aware of, but we can sure as heck put it in remission. And remission is the next best thing. And it feels like a cure, right? Yeah. And I think I shared with my celiac disease, I don't have symptoms of celiac disease right now. I don't have nutritional deficiencies and diarrhea and bloating and all of the symptoms that I would get. It's in remission though, because the minute I get the bright idea to have a New York style bagel, like a real bagel with gluten in it, my immune system's going to go a little bit bonkers again. But it's okay, because on a day-to-day, remission is just as good as a cure for me, at least with this. Like, it's manageable. But telling the person we don't have a cure for it sounds so doom and gloom, and like, oh, this is going to be a chronic struggle. I'm going to have to think about this all day, every day for the rest of my life. This is going to be terrible. Versus, you know, maybe we can cure autoimmunity, maybe we can't. I think that's not super well known at this point, or not super well established. But we can put it in remission, and then you can feel very normal and live a very functional life. How does that sound to you? Like, that's so much more appealing and so much more honest too.
Yeah. Yeah. And even saying we don't know of a cure is better than there is no cure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that I'll try to do with clients, and it sounds similar to this, it's almost just I sort of view it as a reframe. Like what you're describing seems like, okay, what are some of these beliefs that are holding me back? And how can you potentially reframe them in a way that will serve me better and move me forward instead of keeping me stuck? And that's really common in the diet space that we work in too, because these people are given a list of, like what you were saying before, you don't like to think of things as good or bad. Well, they're given a list of, like, these are the good foods, these are the bad foods. So this seed is so deeply planted, and they've tried a million different diets. And I think it can be really helpful in those situations for people that are struggling with, like, adding foods back into their diet because things are so limited, to try to do some of these reframes, like what kind of fears are you having around some of this stuff, and how can you kind of reframe them mentally? And I'm sure, again, like hypnosis and cognitive behavioral strategies for both those things, like the conscious part and the unconscious part, can be important and helpful in reinforcing some of those reframing type strategies.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are certain language patterns that are very powerful, either for good or for bad.
Right.
And your unconscious mind, because it doesn't have verbal language, operates differently. When you have words like not or don't, they kind of get erased because they exist in the conscious, verbal language. There's no such thing as a not or a don't. If I say, Amy, no matter what I say next, don't picture a purple tree with a purple squirrel and the squirrel climbing down and choking on an orange acorn, right? I know you did that. And the reason why that's 100% predictable is because
bad job, Amy.
I'm telling you to visualize, which is connected more to the right brain unconscious, but I'm giving you language. So don't gets completely erased, right? So I'll give you an example that I think really clarifies this. I was working with a client who was coming in to become, trimmer and healthier and to shed some pounds. You'll notice I didn't say lose, because people want to lose weight and quit smoking, right? But what does our society think of losers and quitters? Right? When was the last time you lost something that was a good thing? So there's all kinds of connotations there, right? But anyway, so this woman comes in, and I was just checking. It was the first session. I said, "Do you ever do affirmations?" I absolutely do. Tell me about them. She says, "Well, I stand in front of the mirror every morning. I look in the mirror and I say, I'm not fat. I'm not fat. I'm not fat. I'm not fat." Okay? Your unconscious mind does not calculate not. It literally pulls it out. So she's standing there in front of the mirror saying, "I'm fat. I'm fat. I'm fat," 50 times every morning. Right? It's a great idea, the affirmations, but they need to be worded for what you want, not what you don't want.
Good idea, but the execution needs work.
What's that?
It's a good idea, but the execution needs work.
Right. But these are things that a lot of people don't realize. Words like try, super powerful. Word but is super powerful.
Well, and I think too, like even working with people like us, I have a section on my intake forms, for example, that say, like, what's your number one goal? What's your number two goal? What's your number three goal? And truthfully, like what is most helpful for me as I'm building kind of a treatment plan for people is if they say, number one, get rid of bloating. Number two, have better poops, number 3 have better energy, or like, this. But it does make them start focusing on, oh, I'm bloated, I have crappy poops, and not intended, but totally acknowledged, and I have no energy. So in the language of the appointments, I'm trying to be a little bit more mindful of like flipping it a little bit so that there's not as much of a like reinforcement of that. Again, like for my context, it is helpful to know like what symptoms do you want to get rid of, but then we're not going to dwell on it a ton from there if I can get away with it. Still working on it.
Yeah. No, those kind of subtle changes can make a big difference, for people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think we've talked about this a bit too over the course of our appointments, but I know something that's been helpful for me also is like seeing things as patterns. I know like I've had this dialogue in my head to some degree for a lot of years that like, oh, if I'm really overwhelmed, or if I have a lot of stress, I'll like flake out and I'm not reliable and I'll like ghost, or I'll drop the ball on things that need to happen. But then there's this like shame spiral where it's like, oh, I'm not reliable. I'm such a bad adult. I'm no. And even like, this is unrelated to what I've learned with you, but I know like I kind of nerded out learning the Enneagram, like personality assessment a year or two ago.
Yeah.
And even just something as like rudimentary as that was helpful for me because it let me kind of take away some of the judgment and the shame and pull back a little bit and go, oh, when I do these things, it's not intrinsically that like I suck as a human being. It means that's just like the default programming that when the circuitry is overwhelmed, and I go to like the default programming, this is my flavor of default programming, and it's shared amongst other Enneagram Type 9s, or whatever lens is helpful for you. Some people like Myers-Briggs, some people might benefit from others, but I know like just seeing things as patterns helped me remove some of the judging and the shame that I was doing like internally when I would fall back on one of those less than helpful patterns or programs.
Yeah. I love that you framed it that way. That's been helpful.
Yeah.
Right. And I think those kind of things like the Enneagram and stuff, and even diagnosis to some extent, can have such a positive or negative impact at the exact same time. Right. Mm-hmm. So you can do something like the Enneagram and go, oh, I can see why I have this tendency. Oh, and I can understand. I can kind of shore up against this tendency. But a lot of people will do something like that and they'll say, oh, well, I'm like this, right? And then they take that on as an identity.
Yes.
And identities are very hard to change. I tend to think of them like a hierarchy. You have thoughts, and if you repeat thoughts over and over again, you form a belief. And then if you have the same beliefs over and over again, they create a value. And then all your values come together to create an identity. Higher up that hierarchy you go, the harder it is to change. So sometimes people might, do something like the Enneagram and they'll say, oh, well, I'm a blank, right? And now they are labeled as that identity. And so it's always that double-edged sword, right? But you're right. If you have an understanding and you can watch out for them and taper the way you want, and be more intentional.
I feel like so many things are useful if you just take like a shallow dive into it. So another one, I'll just like the Enneagram again, just like the little bit that I did with it and I learned about it, I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, and it helps me remove the shame and the blaming and be kinder to myself when I do slip into the default programming here and there, because like we all do. Another one I would say is Facebook groups. So like Amy and I have a lot of experience with this. A lot of people who work with us have been in the IBS Facebook groups, the SIBO Facebook group, the Candida Facebook groups. And that is an echo chamber of very, very sick, very terrified, very frustrated people. And it will suck you in, and it will be absolutely detrimental to your health without a shadow of doubt. If you're like newly diagnosed with SIBO, you don't know what it is, you don't know the first thing about this diagnosis, and you're just like, I need to just kind of get a sense of where I'm at in the world again. By all means, go to one of these Facebook groups or a Reddit thread, do just a little bit of cursory research, Google, YouTube, do a little bit of research. But when you start finding yourself really diving deep into the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole, and you're spending hours and hours and hours and hours on these groups, or heaven forbid, if you have friends in those groups now because you've gone back and forth with the same people so many times that now you know each other by name and you're PMing outside the group, that's where it starts to get really detrimental, and it could be a health suck rather than a health benefit. So it's, shallow dive, good. Deep dive, not always so good.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, we know that support groups I shouldn't say we know this. When formulated correctly, right, support groups are a really great thing. But sometimes they become sort of unsupported groups, like you're saying, right? They become doom and gloom and all that kind of thing. And like I said, I spent some time as an addictions counselor, and it was always interesting to talk to people about Al-Anon, which is the group, if you're familiar with, there's AA and then there's Al-Anon.
Yeah.
And the Al-Anon's one for families. You have a really supportive Al-Anon group, and you can have a really sick Al-Anon group, depending on which one you go to, right? Some Al-Anon groups, the whole thing is we're going to get together and we're going to bash each other's spouses who are alcoholic, and we're going to talk about all the crappy things that they do and how alcoholism has destroyed our lives. That is not helpful.
Yeah.
And it comes back to helpful or not helpful, right?
Yeah. Well, and sorry. I was just going to say one other thing that was, again, I know you were touching on identity, kind of creating an identity that might not be serving you towards whatever goal that you're wanting to go towards. It reminds me of, there's a book, it's called Atomic Habits by James Clear. I don't know if you've heard of that book before, but he talks a little bit about this, and it kind of reminds me of that. I know in his book, he sort of talks about almost trying to view yourself as the identity you want to be. So again, if you're someone that's a smoker, think about what would a non-smoker do, and start kind of thinking in those terms and almost creating the identity first. And I don't know if this would be aligned with what you're talking about, but kind of creating okay, I'm a non-smoker now. What would a non-smoker do? Kind of thinking in that way, and that helps build the actual habits and the things that you can do to reinforce the identity. It feels weird at first, like he kind of admitted in the book, to be oh, now I'm someone that I think of as messy. Now I'm going to try to think of myself as clean and an orderly person. How does that change my behavior once I'm working on the identity first? Which I don't know if that's kind of consistent with what you were saying, but it seems sort of aligned with that particular book. And I always kind of like that idea.
It's absolutely consistent. And I would, personally, I would even tweak it a little bit. Because you said, what if you're thinking about yourself as a non-smoker, you're thinking about yourself as where you want to go. I mean, that's a good start. Right. And you talk about so you can change habits. But again, if you go back to the left brain, right brain, and it's not a perfect model, but it's a reasonable model, right? If you go back to the right brain, left brain thing, it's about visualization, right? Your visualization is right there next to your habits, which is right there next to your emotions. I'll give you an example. Sometimes when I'm working at CSU, I remember one particular time where a therapist was behind the one-way mirror, and I said to her, I want you to go back in the room, and I want you to say to the clients, I want you to ask your clients, in 3 months, when this issue is completely resolved, what will that look like? And the therapist said, got it. I said, you got it? And she said, got it. And she goes in and she says, so if things are better in 3 months, what do you think might be different? I went, I'm on the phone going, come back behind one mirror. Right? It seems subtle, but it's not about what you think. It's not about if things are better. And so I explained this to the therapist, say, it's what do you see? Is there, who's with you? What are you wearing? Are you, is anyone talking? What does it sound like? What are they saying? It's actually about seeing, right? So the amazing phenomenon about this is that the therapist gets it right. So they go back in and they deliver the message perfectly. They say, in 3 months, when this issue is completely resolved, what does that look like? The client will answer the wrong question, almost inevitably. The client will say, well, I don't even think I'm going to still be in Colorado. I think I might be blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's not what I asked. It doesn't look Right? So
Right.
it takes it just that one more step further, because if they can see it, right, then they can move toward it. It's not about what you think. And to illustrate just one more quick analogy, watch movies, right? And you take the music out, the emotion goes with it, right? The score is hugely important. Why? Because your emotions and your appreciation for music and aesthetics are right there next to each other. So if you set goals in your left brain, I'm going to achieve this and this and this, and you can come up with strategies in your left brain. That's great. That's all good stuff. But the passion, the drive, the emotion, the habits are all in the unconscious. They're all in the right brain. So if you want to get there, you want to take advantage of that. That's the passion that drives you. That's the gasoline that gets the car to the goal.
Yeah, I like that.
That's a good way to put it. And I'll throw this out there too. Like, I think I've accidentally done some of what Amy described in my life, and I didn't realize it until I was older. And I don't remember. I might have shared this with you, Paul, or maybe I didn't. I would have considered myself very, very introverted up until basically my senior year of high school. I was very quiet. I was very reserved until I got around close friends or family, but it was kind of hard, like, to get people in that friend loop because I was very shy and very reserved. And when I was applying to colleges and I was looking at colleges where I could row, I knew that I was going to be on a team with 60 plus girls, and we were going to be together all the time, and I would be in the door with them all the time, and I would have no privacy, no quiet time. I was just going to be surrounded perpetually by 60 other girls my age doing the same sport every single day for 4 years of my life. And I kind of had the realization, I don't think I'm going to have the luxury of being introverted anymore. And just kind of on a whim, I decided to reinvent myself. And when I went to college, I made a point to be more extroverted, even though it was a bit uncomfortable and weird and I felt awkward. And it was like, I didn't calculate it necessarily. I just decided now's the time. Like, I went to school since kindergarten with the same group of people. They've labeled me a certain way. I have an identity here in Dryden, New York. But when I go to Buffalo for college, I'm going to have the opportunity to build this new identity. And I still remember I met one of my very best friends because in freshman orientation, the summer before our freshman year, there was like a lunch or something, and I didn't know anybody. So I decided, I was like, what would an extrovert do? They would find somebody else who's eating alone, and they would sit down and make a friend. And that's exactly what I did. I lived with her for 3 years. We're still in touch. One of my best friends. And I met her because I decided to be more outgoing and extroverted. And now I would consider myself quite extroverted. But it's like, you almost kind of fake it till you make it, for lack of a better expression. And sometimes that works, man. Like, I've done that on other occasions, and it works.
Yeah, it's amazing. And that's a perfect example of intentionally managing those filters. Is it likely that you have or had a genetic predisposition or a temperament toward being introverted? I'm not saying that stuff doesn't exist. It certainly does. But when it goes to the identity level, it gives it a whole lot more power. So let's say your temperament is 10% introverted. By the time you label yourself that and you start to avoid social situations, and you start to talk about how painfully shy you always are, and so that 10% is now like 90%, and probably most of that is just how you're repeatedly framing it.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you.
I was just gonna say, like, I feel like having had gut issues in the past and working with people kind of that view themselves and label themselves as being sick. I feel like I've been there too, where it's like, oh my gosh, like, I'm too sick to play on this basketball team. I've shared this story before where it's like, I played college basketball for a while, and there was like a period where I was like, oh, I'm too sick to do that. And then kind of at one point I was like, no, I think I can do like 2/4 of it. Maybe not the whole game, but like there was moments where I was able to kind of come out of that. But I think that within our clientele, there's sometimes this sick mentality that really keeps them stuck.
Yes.
And again, I almost think what you said before, like, what does being well look like to you?
Right.
Like trying to manifest and visualize, you know, in 3 months, and
Yeah.
you're doing better. What does that look like? Doing some of those exercises could be really helpful to try to get you out of, at least see you outside of the mentality that you're in now. Um, so yeah, that, I think, I just thought that that was kind of an interesting connection to the identity piece too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I'm not saying that people don't actually have temperaments and personalities, and people don't actually have pain and negative things in life.
Right.
In fact, one of the risks that I'll say of solution focused therapy, if it's not managed well, and again, I see this a lot in maybe newer therapists, is that people can feel unheard. Right. So the very first session, someone comes in and they tell you all their woes, and you go, yes, but what would it be like when you're so much better? And they go, wow, I'm not going to this therapist. They're like,
right.
And there's a thing in neurolinguistic programming called pacing and leading, right? So you pace them where they're at, and then you lead them to a new place. And so it is important to pace them and hear them. And I'll say things a lot like, I hear the pain that you have, and I know that's real for you. I just want you to know that. And yet I wonder if the way we're talking about it is helpful for you in the long run, right? So I start to lead it toward another direction.
Yeah.
Right.
And just real quickly back to that kind of filtering system, we're filtering out so much stuff. Our idea of possibilities, I've got this problem, and there are two possibilities, possible ways I could handle it. The reality is there's probably thousands, but we have de facto ruled out almost all of them because we don't believe they could happen. We don't believe it could be good for us, or whatever, all that kind of stuff. And so it's about opening up. What are some other ways to think?
And I know we need to wrap up here so we can let you get to your appointment, but I'll end us with a little bit of a chuckle at my husband's expense. So the idea that there's all of this data coming in and all of these possibilities, and our brains are filtering them, and two people could have the exact same experience and have totally different experiences of that. Yeah. So when we were on our honeymoon, and I will say my husband is quite a bit more left-brained and a bit more anxious, but like he catastrophizes way more than I do, is really what it is. When we were on our honeymoon, we went to this like middle of nowhere, Cannon Beach, Oregon, like little tiny town in Oregon, beautiful. They filmed part of the Goonies there. It was a hoot. And we're at this adorable little town with like 300 people who live there year round. And we got chit-chatting. I needed to get some herbs, and I found like a local herbalist and chiropractor, husband and wife couple. And we went to their little shop and I got some herbs, and we got chatting with them. And they told us about this secret hike that none of the tourists know. Only the local people know about this hike. And if you go this way, you will end up with the perfect view of the big rock that is so famous at that beach. And we're like, that is so cool. Thank you so much. So we go on this hike, and it's in the middle of the forest. Beautiful, 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 like lush green, like moss and ferns, and it's like Fern Gully. It was amazing.
Yeah.
We're walking through the woods on this little hike, and I'm looking around the woods, and I'm just like, wow. I'm in awe. I'm like, wow, this is so beautiful and majestic. It's Fern Gully. This is amazing, and this is so wonderful on our honeymoon. It was so nice of them to send us on this hike. We go on this hike. We didn't make it to the rock. I don't know if we took a wrong turn or what, but we get back out of the woods. The moment we get out of the forest, my dang husband goes, oh, oh. I'm like, what's wrong with you, dude? He's like, oh, I thought for sure we were going to run into a bear or we were going to get like murdered in that forest somewhere. He later on said he thought that those nice people were axe murderers, and that they led us to that isolated path specifically so that they could kill us, and they wouldn't hear the screams in the town. And he thought for sure, this is too remote, too desolate, this is very suspicious, this is very stressful. he went on that stupid hike and was all stressed out and paranoid the whole time. And I'm looking around with stars in my eyes thinking, this is like Fern Gully. Oh, this is the best thing ever in my whole life. So that's a good example of two different people went on the same hike, the same place, the same time, two different experiences. And now I make fun of that. And I try to gradually teach him that not everything is the end of the world and he doesn't have to catastrophize everything. So
I have a video on my website that I recorded. It's been months and months ago, but it's about taking a news vacation. It's all about what you're talking about. Yep. We have negativity bias, right? We all do. And it comes evolutionary. It makes sense, right? When you're a cave person and you're looking at a beautiful butterfly and there's a saber-toothed tiger, guess what's more important? Okay? But as you fast forward through time, that's become less and less useful. And in a world where, you can pick up your phone and have instant access to 3 million pieces of bad news that you can't do anything about in an instant, that causes anxiety, and it is not even a little bit adaptive, right? If my life is, fear is about a clear and present danger. Anxiety is about what we imagine could happen. And so we all get locked into this idea of, well, we need to know what's going on. And I use the example, if there's a child who's starving, right, in Bangladesh, do I care about that? Yes. That touches my heart, right? Can I do anything about it? No, not likely. Is it a clear and present danger to me? No. So as we inundate ourselves nonstop with all of these things, it's creating depression, it's creating anxiety, and it's not helpful. Going back to, it's not whether it's right or wrong. I'm not saying, well, you shouldn't watch the news. I'm saying, is it helpful for you? And it's probably about this much helpful. The rest is just a bunch of psychological trauma that you're imposing on yourself.
Yeah. And I will say he's the bigger news consumer out of the two of us for sure. So I'll have to show him that video on your website. Which was this not the most beautiful segue on planet Earth, by the way? Your website, which is Cohesive SOULutions. So SOUL Utions, like solutions, but with soul in the middle there. So Cohesive SOULutions is where you can find more about Paul. But my goodness, I could talk to you all day, Paul, but I know you have an appointment to get to. So I'm going to have to kick you off of the podcast.
Okay,
but
I
will
say,
not
be too offended.
The door is totally open. We would love to have you back for a part 2. I think that would be a hoot, and we would have so much more to talk about. But thank you so much for coming on. I think this will be really valuable for our listeners, and I hope they check out your info again at cohesivesoulutions.com, and I will link that in the show notes for today too. So guys, until next time, we will see you on the IBS
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was awesome. Love to do it again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.